Is technology killing privacy? I would say only if we let it, right? Like there's a lot we can do, and there's a lot we can do both in terms of how we design technology as well as what public policy requires from companies to make sure privacy and technology can coexist.
That was Florian Schaub, an associate professor at UMSI and at the College of Engineering. And this is Information Changes Everything, where we put the spotlight on news and research from the world of information science. You're going to hear from experts, students, researchers, and other people making a real difference. As always, we're presented by the University of Michigan School of Information, UMSI for short. Learn more about us at si.umich.edu. I'm your host, Kate Atkins. Today, we'll hear more from Florian Schaub as he looks at the relationship between privacy and technology, from social media oversharing to the invisible data trails we leave online. This talk reveals how companies like Google and Facebook track our actions and how this data collection impacts our daily lives. Schaub also addresses potential solutions, like innovative approaches to better inform and protect consumers. Before we jump in, a few other people and projects that you should know about. More than 3 million people worldwide have taken the Python for Everybody course through online learning platform Coursera. The course was created by UMSI clinical professor Charles Severance, who has worked for decades to make programming easy to learn. Master's students at UMSI have developed digital solutions to enhance surgical training through an innovative collaboration with the U of M Clinical Simulation Center. Some say the project significantly impacted their career paths. Finally, not satisfied with just one Wordle a day, many are feeding their puzzle addiction with Wordle clones. But now, AP News says the New York Times is sending takedown notices to Wordle-like sites, claiming copyright infringement. For more on all of these stories, check out si.umich.edu or click the link in our show notes. Now, back to Florian Schaub.
When we think about privacy and technology have really been intertwined for a long time. Samuel Warren and Louis Brandeis, who would end up becoming a Supreme Court justice, wrote a very influential law review article in 1890, which established the right to be let alone. And the technology that spurred them to think about privacy and privacy protection, the need for privacy protections, was the Kodak camera. First time that you could actually take snap photos of people as they walked past, rather than people having to pose for longer times to actually get a sharp picture. In the 60s, Alan Weston started formulating what we now call information privacy, and this notion that privacy is about individuals controlling and managing and being able to delete information about themselves and deciding who has that information. And his thinking was spurred by the development of the mainframe computers. Right? So while when we talk about privacy today, we're often thinking social media and other such technologies. Really, technology has always been driving privacy, and privacy and technology have always been in some kind of tension. And if we look at privacy, there are all kinds of tensions that we see. On the one hand, we have government interests in terms of safety, law enforcement, national security. We have business interests. Companies are trying to mine data about individuals to better sell products to them. We also have just personal interests in sharing data, right? And we undermine our own privacy sometimes because we want to socialize, because using the technology is convenient, because we want to present ourselves online in certain ways. And then technological advancement kind of keeps pushing and accelerating these tensions further and further. When we think about privacy, a lot of people think about social media and how people kind of overshare on social media. But it's often not just what you post or share yourself. It's also about the traces you leave online or leave in general when you use technology. Right? And that starts with very basic and benign things like websites wanting to better understand where their visitors coming from. What are they doing on the website? Where maybe fall-off points where people fail to kind of complete the transaction. However, one of the problems when it comes to privacy is that these analytic services are actually being provided by two companies primarily, namely Google and Facebook. This is a great study by Princeton researchers in 2016. They looked at the top 1 million websites, and they found that 75% of them had Google Analytics tracking code on them, and 25% had Facebook Analytics tracking code on them. And while it's convenient for website providers to use some of these services, the services that Google and Facebook offer here, it also means that Google and Facebook get a pretty comprehensive picture of where you're going when you're going from one website to the other. And the same is true when you use mobile apps. Many apps have tracking code embedded as an additional revenue source for the app providers. And that's not just the case for free apps. Even paid apps often have the same tracking code and are still tracking you in the same way. This type of tracking and consumer tracking doesn't just occur in online or on your phone. It also occurs in stores. You walk around and you go shopping. There might actually be Bluetooth beacons installed in the store that keep track of which aisles are you going down, what you're looking at. Many of you might have loyalty cards for grocery stores you go to, right? Those are nice because they give you discounts, but also give the store permission to basically keep track of your shopping profiles and better understand who you are as a consumer. And as we move towards smart homes and smart cities, potential for data collection gets more and more. The problem is that often, while we might think we are using technology, we actually end up being the product. For example, we see this when you actually want to buy ads. So you can tailor based on location, based on age, gender, but then there are also all kinds of detailed targeting options you can set. So I want to target households who are in the top 10% of income, or I want to target people who are currently living away from family, or maybe closer to our heart, people who are Michigan fans. All of this information that's being collected allows Facebook and other companies to create very detailed profiles of who you are, and then turn around and sell access to those profiles to marketers and companies. Beyond these direct interactions, there's also a whole economy of data brokers, which basically exist for the whole purpose of monetizing data they can get their hands on. For example, sell data enrichment services. So if a company has, let's say, your phone number or your email address, but doesn't know anything else about you, they can go to a data broker and use a data enrichment service and say like, hey, what do you know about this email address? Or what do you know about this phone number? And that way, get information about, we possibly get your name, but more interesting to them, get your actual address, understand where you live, understand whether you may be in the market for a car right now, whether you are pregnant, all kinds of things that are being kept track of, and that then might make it easier to target advertising to you. Shoshana Zuboff calls this surveillance capitalism. So these companies, while they create services and technologies that are seemingly technologies, really exist to monetize data and do that at a large scale. One question we can ask is, well, what's the problem with that, right? Like we live in a capitalist society. I actually like it if I see advertisement that's relevant to me. What are the problems here? There are many, but it starts with something simple, such as unwanted disclosure. If your information is out there, companies, for example, can track your location. That information can also be sold and made be available to people you might not know or might not want to have access to that data. It can be used for surveillance by the government, for example, to surveil and arrest immigrants, or by police to monitor and try to identify protesters. It can also be exploited to exert political influence. So some of you might have heard about the Cambridge Analytica Facebook scandal a couple of years ago, where basically this marketing company, Cambridge Analytica, gained access to 50 million Facebook profiles and the connections, and then used this information in political campaigns to basically target political advertising and different types of political messages depending on who you are. Data is also used for discrimination. Based on gender or age, people might see different ads and might be offered different prices. It also leads to racism. Really interesting studies that show that if you type a black-sounding name into a search engine, you're much more likely to get offers for bail bonds and other services compared to a white-sounding name. And we also see that some of these privacy harms particularly affect lower income people. Virginia Eubanks, in her book Automating Inequality, talks about how people who are reliant on government benefits, for example, and similar services, are made to reveal much more about their personal affairs and effects than other people, and are basically subject to kind of continuous scrutiny and monitoring. I think one of the really sometimes difficult to grasp privacy harms is the absence of opportunity. And you might never know that you didn't get this job interview because somehow a social media post from 10 years ago suggested that you might be a flaky employee. Because how the data flows and how it's used often makes it very opaque when decisions are being made about you. And that's one of the key issues. When we look at kind of like how do consumers think about this, in general, people are concerned about data used by companies and by governments. But at the same time, they also feel like they don't have control over how companies use the data. And so there's concern, but they don't know what to do about it. And sometimes this is called the privacy paradox in the literature. So this notion that people say they're concerned about privacy, but then they still use social media and they post on social media and buy smart speakers and other things. I like to think of it more as the fallacy of revealed preferences. So in economics, revealed preferences is this notion that we can best measure preferences, like true preferences, by looking at people's behaviors. And there's some value to that. But when it comes to privacy, it's unfortunately not quite as easy. In my own research, we've been studying exposure-sensitive populations in particular. So these are populations that have heightened interest in protecting their privacy, and we try to understand, like, are they able to protect their privacy? And what we find is that that's often not the case. So we did research with undocumented immigrants and found that they use technologies the same way as all of us do. They're aware of some of the risks, but really struggle to protect their privacy as they use technologies. More recently, we conducted a study with sex workers in Europe, where we found that while sex workers embrace technology for their work, they also use technology for personal reasons, but really struggle to keep kind of their work identity and their personal identity separate. It's things like social media services, recommending clients as potential contacts, revealing clear names to clients, or revealing their work identity to their friends and family. In other work, we've been talking to older adults about their privacy and security needs and behaviors, and what we find is that concerns about privacy sometimes lead to a fear of adopting technology. People are interested in using technology, but are worried about the potential privacy implications and security implications and don't do it because of that. While at the same time, we also see increased risk-taking because the way they think about risks might not be aligned with the actual risks that exist. And we find the same thing at the other end of the spectrum, looking at young children. So I'm working with child psychologists and pediatric researchers here at Michigan. We've been trying to understand how children think about data flows. And what we see is that they actually have a really good understanding of how recommendations work. Why am I seeing a certain video on YouTube, for example, or where do these Netflix recommendations come from? But what they struggle with is that many of their explanations are based on what they see right in front of them, visual cues in the interface. But often these things happen invisibly in the background, and these invisible practices are often clear to children or difficult for them to understand. So lots of issues why people struggle to protect their privacy. And what it comes down to is that we as humans are just not very good at making consistent decisions, particularly when we face uncertainty both in terms of, well, what are actually the data practices that a company engages in, but also what are the risks associated with that. We need context to make decisions. And in technological context, sometimes we might be lacking the right information to understand what constitutes the context and how that works. And at the same time, there are lots of psychological tricks that can be exploited to get us to reveal more information than we might want to. The first aspect is when it comes to uncertainty is that there are actually documents where you can learn about data practice of a company, privacy policies, right? And usually at this point, if we were in person, I would ask like, oh, how many of you have read privacy policies in the last month? Maybe one or two hands go up, maybe a few more, depending on what the audience is. But most people don't read privacy policies. Now, I would actually argue that's a good thing. Privacy policies should be long, and they should probably be even longer. They should look more like SEC filings where companies in detail need to describe their practices and what are they doing with the data of the customers. But we need to stop pretending that these are documents for consumers, right? Like no one reads these privacy policies. And right now they don't actually serve the consumers well, and they don't serve regulators or oversight authorities well either, because they're way too vague to really understand what's going on. And all of this leads to what Nora Draper and Joe Giroux call digital resignation. So people are concerned about their privacy, but they also want to enjoy the technology. So what they end up doing is they kind of close their eyes, cross their fingers, and hope for the best, and hope that ultimately the companies are looking out for their interests, which unfortunately is not really the case. In addition to that, privacy behavior can also be easily swayed, and with simple tricks, people can be made to disclose much more information than they might want to. And more recently, this whole field has kind of been associated with the term of dark patterns, basically design patterns in interfaces and interactions that are meant to kind of like trick people or sway people into doing things that might go against their actual interests. So is technology killing privacy? What we've talked about so far doesn't look too promising, right? But there's some hope. First, we're actually hearing much more about privacy issues, and they've really come into the spotlight, I'd say, in the last 5 years. We're also seeing much more regulation focused on privacy. Europe's General Data Protection Regulation was the most heaviest lobbied piece of legislation in the history of the European Union, and it still ended up being a very pro-consumer law that actually increased and improved privacy protections for Europeans, but because of its extraterritorial applicability also around the world. In the US, we saw California adopt the first comprehensive privacy law in 2018 and just went into effect last year. And as part of the last election in 2020, Californians adopted a proposition called the California Privacy Rights Act that further increases privacy protections in California. Brazil and other companies have been adopting comprehensive privacy laws. Maybe I should explain what that means. It means a comprehensive privacy law is not just constrained to a specific context, such as HIPAA for healthcare on the federal level or FERPA for education data, but instead just applies to the processing of personal identifiable information, regardless of what the context or the domain is in which that data is being processed. So a lot of our work has kind of looked at, well, what can we actually do here? The three important things that help people make better decisions when it comes to privacy and make it easier for people to manage their privacy. One is the information we give to people has to be relevant to what they're currently doing, right? When you go to a news website, you might want to know, well, are you tracking what I'm reading? Who is that data being shared with? Who else has access to that? Finding that information in a privacy policy is actually very, very difficult because there are all kinds of other things in the privacy policy. Basically, any potential interaction you might ever have with a company is going to be listed in the privacy policy. So it becomes really difficult to really understand what's happening in a particular moment. What we've shown in our work is that actually one way forward is to focus on unexpected or surprising practices. So in this particular study, we looked at fitness trackers, and we showed our participants a fitness tracker. There's a Fitbit watch, and then gave them a list of data practices. Some were real, some were fake, and asked them, do you think this product engages in this practice? And by doing this, we found for some practices, such as the collection of step data, almost every one of our participants expected that that's the case. That's why you would buy a fitness tracker, right? Like you want to count your steps. However, then for other aspects, like the collection of location data, only 31% of participants expected this, likely because this data collection doesn't actually happen on the watch. It happens in the mobile app, the mobile companion app that comes with a watch and lives on the phone. Right now, if we're thinking about, well, what are the things we need to most urgently inform people about? The location collection is probably the practice we might want to highlight, or potentially also ask for opt-in consent instead of just collecting the data by default. It's also important that information is understandable. Right? Like I keep harping on the privacy policies and how they're difficult to understand or too long, but they don't have to be. The Crown-Leach-Pliley Act, for example, which regulates the financial industry, requires that companies provide concise privacy notices that follow this 2-page format. And while there are issues with this format, for sure, it's very concise, it's down to the point, and it makes choices and makes information and choices available to consumers in a consistent way. We're thinking a lot about how we can better integrate privacy information and controls directly into user experiences, rather than having them hidden away in the privacy policy or overwhelming people with like lots of text or choices. And we kind of think along 4 dimensions when we think about the design of privacy interfaces. It's when do you show it to users? What's the channel? Can you actually show it on the same device? Usually that's the case for like a phone or a computer, but maybe not so useful for a smart thermostat, right? Like you don't want to read a privacy notice on your thermostat. So in those cases, we might need secondary channels like sending an email or leveraging a mobile app that might exist on a phone. And then how can we really engage people with this information in a meaningful way? And we've been working a lot on beyond kind of like trying to establish these best practices and guidelines and communicating those to industry. We're also thinking about, well, how can we help consumers in the moment? So by reducing the threshold for engaging with privacy settings and making otherwise invisible information say and invisible, we can get people's attention and can get them to think about and reflect on their privacy settings. We can go even a bit further and analyze the app code to figure out what might the application be using this information for. In other work, we analyze privacy policies using deep learning techniques and natural language processing techniques to build a chatbot. So Pribot, you can go to pribot.org and try this out. You can ask questions about a company, and then the system answers based on information from the privacy policy for that company. And sometimes it can give directly short answers, or it gives excerpts from the privacy policy. Similar work, we looked at links in privacy policies to try to identify potential privacy controls and opt-out links. And we extracted them from the privacy policy and built a browser extension that you can install called Opt-out Easy. And then when you go to a website, it shows you all the available opt-outs in a easily accessible interface without having to look for them in the privacy policy. So with that, I'm at the end, and I started with this question: is technology killing privacy? I would say only if we let it, right? Like there's a lot we can do, and there's a lot we can do both in terms of how we design technology as well as what public policy requires from companies to make sure privacy and technology can coexist.
You can watch the full talk by clicking the link in our show notes. To learn more about upcoming events like this, visit us at umsi.info/events. And tune in next time to hear from UMSI Research Fellow Xuan Liu during a 2023 talk at UMSI focused on sustainable remote work.
Since the shift to remote work, the emotional issues became more significant due to this something like isolation. However, at virtual workplaces without the face-to-face interactions, emotions are much harder to observe. However, as remote workers are using online platforms to communicate in their daily working, is it feasible to use the platforms as a channel to monitor their emotions at scale?
That's in our next episode. Before we go, did you know that we post the latest on information science news and research every day? Keep your finger on the pulse by following UMSI on X, Instagram, LinkedIn, and Facebook. Search for University of Michigan School of Information or click the links in our show notes. The University of Michigan School of Information creates and shares knowledge so that people like you will use information with technology to build a better world. Don't forget to subscribe to Information Changes Everything on your favorite podcasting platform. And if you've got questions, comments, or episode ideas, send us an email at umsipodcast@umich.edu. From all of us at the University of Michigan School of Information, thanks for listening.